we go. Okay, we made it to the final session, what will undoubtedly be another 5 fantastic talks. You might call it a catch-all. I think it's going to be fabulous. So to kind of keep the energy up, because we don't want it to drop on the last day. It always happens at conferences. Kind of riffing off of Monique's favorite neurotransmitter, we're going to do some walk-up songs. So everyone's going to have a walk-up song. So to kick us off, and I'm just going to kind of softly play it into the cube. Am I funny? So coming up to California Love, we have Dr. Kilan Ashad-Bishop, who is currently wrapping up her postdoc at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center in Miami. But outside of that, she also is known for STEM Noir, which is a first-of-its-kind conference for Black and non-binary people in STEM. And today she's going to be telling us her fantastic work in the first epidemiology talk of Leading Edge about social determinants of health. Take it away, Dr. Kilan.
I was like, I don't need that.
You don't need the cube, you're mine.
Testing. All right. So, hi. So, I'm Kilan. Today I'll be talking to you about socio-environmental determinants of cancer disparities. And this is a lot of the work that I've done during my postdoc at the Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center in Miami, Florida. So before we get to any of that fun stuff, let's talk about me. I'm obviously from California. I love outside. As of my 30th birthday, I made a resolution to climb a mountain a year. So this is me earlier this year climbing Table Mountain in South Africa. When I'm not doing something outside, I'm spending time inside with my massive plant collection and my cat babies. That's September Wind. That's Sunday Bella. I miss them a lot. And you can always catch me looking for a snack, namely potatoes in any form. And so, with that context, I left California and went to Morgan State University and eventually ended up in a PhD program in cancer biology, where I earned my PhD at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And I really went from proteins, which I was studying doing some pancreatic cancer research at Morgan, didn't get too deep into it, and then studied a Wnt transcription cofactor for its ability to modify the development and progression of Wnt tumors in mice. At University of Miami, I had some really questionable experiences in grad school. And so, wasn't great. But everything happens for a reason, because it inspired me to actually do a 12-week policy fellowship at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I wanted to know why I had some of these experiences that I had, and really that was the first time I saw Dr. Montgomery's work and was able to interface with a lot of scholars who were describing some of the experiences of Black folks, of women, of non-binary people in STEM as larger phenomena that are actually systemic issues and not the fault of the individual. And so I was like, oh, okay, I like it up here. I like it where we talk about systems and not individual faults. And so then my following research experiences really kind of went that direction. So I did one postdoctoral fellowship for a year in education and human development. I worked with a community psychologist, a clinical psychologist doing community-based work to look at the role of community-based organizations in mitigating some of the health and educational disparities that came about at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I went back to biomed, but with this lens of being a transdisciplinary at that point, health disparities researcher really interested in cancer disparities and equity. And so I really went from proteins all the way to population science, but I don't discount the contribution of that policy fellowship and of policy to my journey because it informed what I view as the outcome of my work. So, into cancer. Disparities exist across the cancer continuum, and a disparity is basically a differential outcome based on race or socioeconomic status or gender, right? And there's all kinds of disparities. And because cancer is a disease that develops over a long period of time, you have disparities in the development and progression of the disease. We've heard a lot of that talk, a lot of those talks during the symposium so far. There are also disparities in prevention behaviors like cancer screening, detection. So to whom tests are accessible and doctors are accessible, and who detects and gets their disease diagnosed in time for treatment to be successful and possible, and survivorship to be of greater probability. And so with that in mind, the old school was like, okay, we see disparities, so like let's figure out the biological basis of these disparities. And there are some biological determinants of cancer risk, but over time, we've realized that one, not everything is, genetic. You're not born with it. This is not Maybelline, right? The extent of your biological risk is actually determined by some exposures, their lifestyle, influence, right? And so like radiation, tobacco, your exposure to cancer-causing substances. But that still doesn't exactly explain all of the disparities that we see. And over time, there's been an enhanced recognition of the role of social risk factors. And some of these seem pretty abstract, right? Because you're like, what does education, inherently have to do with a cancer outcome? But over time, and we'll talk about this later in the talk, each of these domains of social determinants of health has come to be more appreciated in the context of how they pattern cancer outcomes. I particularly, in this postdoc, focused on healthcare access and quality and neighborhood and the built environment, which we'll talk about. So this is an adapted framework from a recent commentary that I published, and this is how I conceptualize the work that I've done looking at the intersection of climate justice and cancer disparities. So when I was in grad school, Dr. Montgomery was talking about if somebody is performing great in all these other domains and then not doing great in your environment, you're probably the problem. That was literally the way I approached grad school. I was like, oh, y'all are kind of tripping. So I'm going to live a double life and do some environmental justice advocacy. And in case I ever have to leave grad school, I'm going to have a job. And so I had this double life. They've kind of come together in this postdoc. And because of that experience, I was able to conceptualize the differences in vulnerability among different populations when we talk about the intersection of climate and cancer. So we could talk about exposure. I'll use the wildfires example because Canada just had the wildfires and we saw the decreased air quality in New York, right? So think about wildfire happens, you have particulate matter in the air, and that's before you get to the way that a wildfire might alter an ecological context and alter the water and soil that we interface with on a day-to-day, right? But not everybody who has increased risk of exposure, which just everybody's risk is going up over time because climate change, but we won't go there. Before you think about the exposure, you have to think about someone's sensitivity. So do you live in a neighborhood that actually has the trees that would enhance your air quality after an exposure, right? And that's systemically determined. How many trees have been planted in a neighborhood over time? This is not you grabbing a tree and planting it. But there is kind of this individual domain of adaptive capacity, earned privilege. So if I have the attained education, formal education to know I shouldn't breathe this air and I grab a mask, that's my adaptive capacity. And so our vulnerability to cancer disparities and climate justice really kind of lives at the intersection of those. So with that in mind, my first research question for my postdoc was how do sociodemographic indicators of climate vulnerability associate with cancer screening participation? And this is transdisciplinary, and it pulled from really the emergency management and risk reduction literature, and then also the cancer screening and behavioral risk factor literature. So I used machine learning techniques, namely k-means cluster analysis, which in 3 seconds, spreads your data across 2 dimensions and then rotates centroids to find clusters of like data. So you see that in functional genomics work a lot, but I applied it to Miami-Dade County census tracts to look at what neighborhood types I would be able to define, and then look at associated rates of cancer screening participation. And what I was able to do with this methodology was actually define neighborhood types and retain actionable information that could inform interventions. So if I was to zoom in on cluster 1 right here, number 1, I can tell you exactly where those clusters are in Miami-Dade County. I can describe their rates of cancer screening participation in real time and the evolution of those over time. And I can also tell you how you might think about improving access to cancer screening participation, which is super relevant at Sylvester because we have a game changer vehicle which offers place-based cancer care. So I was literally like, hi, boss. My boss runs that. It's here you go. She was like, oh, this is great. So that's always great to hear during your postdoc. My second question was really more exposure related. So I wanted to understand how hurricane exposure in Miami-Dade County would affect survival among people diagnosed with cancer. So I made you wait for it, but we made it. And so I really started this work with Hurricane Andrew, which is a Category 5 storm that leveled South Florida in 1992. It leveled Homestead, to be specific. People lost their homes completely. They were displaced and never went back to that neighborhood. And so you think about, one, just like interrupted access to care, but two, like the stress, right, of being exposed to a storm like that. But that data was really old, to be honest. It was kind of hard to work with. So I made a more recent question because I saw that overall, there was no difference between the exposed and unexposed groups, but I got this cool preliminary result that showed that when I stratified the analyses, the survival analyses by race and ethnicity, you could actually see that the trends changed. So I went from having a statistically significant difference among racial and ethnic groups in the unexposed cohort to everybody kind of doing the same. And I was like, well, what's going on here? So I needed a slightly larger cohort. I looked at the 2005 hurricane season, which is actually the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record until 2020, and did the same analysis. So overall, this is something interesting because it's counter to the literature. The exposed group, folks who were diagnosed during that hurricane season, actually did better. And I was like, well, what's going on here? I know how to do science. So it altered outcomes for cancer patients, but the effect actually varied by race, ethnicity as well. And when you dive into the different racial and ethnic groups that are predominant in South Florida, what I saw was that non-Hispanic white and Hispanic Latino populations actually did better when they were exposed. These are people with cancer, actually did better in terms of their survival probability was higher after exposure to the hurricane. Non-Hispanic Black patients, however, the only ones where exposure to a hurricane actually patterned their survival so that they would have lower probability of survival. And the Hispanic Latino group improved like statistically significantly. So I was like, what's going on here? Now, all of that has been quantitative. I also just want to highlight the fact that, like I mentioned, I'm transdisciplinary, I'm mixed methods. So the other kind of pressing hazard that we have in South Florida is extreme heat. That's a little harder to quantify. Like in terms of heat as an exposure, there's a little bit of work on greenness and like breast cancer survivorship, but it's not a lot. We're doing a qualitative investigation to understand how people with cancer are being affected during treatment by extreme temperatures in Miami-Dade County. And that'll inform some like deeper kind of causal work. So old school, we talked about like social risk and social determinants over here and like biological risk in the other corner. And like researchers segregated to what they thought was most important. But yay, now as time has gone on, not the typo. That's it. Don't mess with your slides too close to the top because this is what happens. Now we have a greater appreciation for the fact that social exposures can actually modify biological risk. So if you think about like I mentioned, the psychosocial stress associated with like a exposure to a hurricane, there's a body of evidence that seeks to understand the biological burden of that. And a lot of it is like epigenomic work, but there's an entire concept of an exposome that is complementary to the human genome. You can understand how these social exposures actually translate to biological risk. And beyond those that don't directly modify biological risk, there's also social exposures that just drive patterns in biological risk. You can't really divorce the way that we function biologically from the way that we live societally. And so that's the work that I essentially am going to do over time, figuring out how social and structural exposures influence biological risk, mainly looking at by what mechanisms do environmental exposures increase biological determinants of cancer risk. I'm particularly interested in hurricanes and wildfires for their ability to modify the environment around us, and also by what mechanisms do social interventions enhance access to care among patients with cancer. So that work is really on health-seeking behaviors and barriers to care. An example of that is I have a project studying housing instability and eviction moratorium policies as tools for neighborhood stabilization, which then stabilizes access to care. So my projects are wide-ranging. And I like it that way. And like I said, the outcome of my work is not necessarily an improved treatment, right? This is where I kind of divest from the traditional scientific enterprise, where like you're looking for the commercialization of your end product. The end product of my work is justice-oriented health policy and interventions. And in reality, every policy has health implications. So like I said, wide-ranging work. And that just leads me to my last point, which is that really in our world, in our changing world, all research is health disparities research, because you can't divorce what happens biologically from what's going on socially. And as I've been listening to all of your amazing talks, like I've had to retain my like population science questions, but you might get some emails from me because there's some, fundamental considerations with what model systems you use, from where they're derived, and like broader applicability that, like I said, make us all health disparities researchers. And in 15 seconds, I'll just highlight STEM Noir, which is a community that I started during my postdoctoral journey. Like I said, I like to think my experience in grad school happened for a reason. So in 2019, co-founded STEM Noir with a college friend who's also a Black woman in STEM. She and I recruited a team, and we have had 2 virtual conferences, and next week we have our first in-person in San Juan, Puerto Rico. We're a research and wellness community for Black women and non-binary people in STEM. We host wellness programs year-round, and the conference is really our big research effort. So that's been beautiful as well. With that, I'll just acknowledge the National Cancer Institute that provides the funding for the T32 for my work, my mentors, my main collaborator in the Rosenstiel School who informed the hurricane work. And I'll be carving out most of this at the American Cancer Society, where I just accepted a role as a principal scientist. So, thank you. Thank you. So it's PI level. If you want to write me in as a collaborator to grants, I'm available. And then eventually I will navigate back to tenure track. But I think academia has a reckoning to do, and I don't want to be a part of it. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. I think it's really relevant to, be conscious about, these things, because actually it seems that long-term, these interventions are cheaper than other interventions. So could you comment a little bit on, the economics surrounding the policies you're proposing, or, whatever your findings are?
Yeah. So I'll just use COVID as an example. We literally had a very poor policy response to COVID. And as a result, now we see so many people suffering from long COVID. And we, as a healthcare system, have to accept the burden and the financial responsibility of caring for those people. And to an extent, some policymakers will go, it's less of our issue because we don't have universal health care. But there's still a cost associated with providing care to an increasingly sick population. So most people who are, and there's some folks at the American Cancer Society who are already doing work to merge housing data and housing assistance data into large-scale cancer registry data to understand how, like I said, stabilizing housing could keep people from dying from cancer. And then we have a healthier, more productive, more viable society. There's importance in thinking about, like I said, cancer as a continuum and all the ways that we could intervene in cancer and beyond to have a more healthy society.
Thank you.
Lindsay, Albert Einstein. Beautiful talk. I had you mentioned it, and I was going to ask you about this. I've been fascinated as well by this emerging concept of the expososome, and it's really this cumulative, the accumulation of these many factors over time. So I guess could you just give some insight about the way to tackle such a challenging problem to actually investigate the key drivers of some of these, because it is multiple factors are feeding into this.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, the exposome was a derivative of our success with the human genome, right? And so Whereas the human genome was like, let's map every gene in the human body, the exposome is like more specific. So there's an exposome that's being defined for breast cancer to understand how experiences over time from preconception, like fetal exposures, all the way to like when a maybe 65-year-old woman is presenting with breast cancer in a clinic, to understand all of the genomic changes that have happened and to factor those into the way that you conceive one, like treatment, but it's really an argument for precision medicine. And so with the exposome, there are methodologies where you can basically do genome-wide exposome studies and like look at how different variables are interacting. They're kind of complicated statistical analyses, but the long and the short of it is that you want to make sure that you're accounting for, at the very least, you want to make sure that you're accounting for the ways in which different populations might respond differently to the intervention that you're proposing.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
That was a beautiful talk. I'm inspired. It was awesome. So related question, I think, to Lindsay's. What do you think the factors are that are going into the differences you see in the non-Hispanic Black population with cancer after the hurricane?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in short, when you think about the aftermath of a disaster and like define your disaster, that is when our health systems tend to be like the most responsive to things that day to day we deem not our problem. And so like in a usual circumstance where like person comes to hospital, we deliver care. In the aftermath of a disaster, we're like, oh, maybe we should think about place-based care. But there's still disparities in like who might trust that care, who might access that care. And so that's like really behavioral and systemic. There may also be, and this is like, I would have to show you the geographic distribution of where the hurricane hit and what the composition of those communities, but there may also be some stress that is directly translated into the exposome of being displaced from your home for 15 years. Unfortunately, a lot of the exposome work is really new, and also people's biological data is theirs and it's valuable. And so like in population studies, you know, we're just kind of getting to the point where we have like the all of us efforts, but like a lot of large population level cohorts don't collect social data. They don't collect anything past like zip code. So it's hard to do these analyses. A reason I made the decision to go to the American Cancer Society is because they have cohorts and they have biological and social data. So I'm excited to be in proximity to those resources. Okay.
That's amazing. This is just absolutely incredible talk. I think sort of following up on Alina's question. So yeah, you see this very striking effect from the 2005 hurricane season, but with the Hurricane Andrew data, right, you also see that an exposure event can be sort of an equalizer, sort of erasing some people's like protection from these things. Do you think that there is some fundamental difference about the response in these cases? Do you think it's like a sort of an idiosyncrasy of these two events? Like, how do you think about that comparison?
That is such a perfect like closing question. I'll try to keep it brief, but that's an exciting question. So Hurricane Andrew actually changed the landscape of emergency response in this country. So like when I say, I should have put a picture up, but like hurricane was flat. I'm talking about roofs flying off, I'm talking about houses. Like one day you had a lot and the next day you did not. And so a lot of the like response to, I mean, we didn't do great, but a lot of the response to Katrina was like informed by changes that had happened. And so that is an example of what happens when we are intentional about like learning lessons and like implementing change, right? But there's also a degree like to which in this society we normalize some of these like climate exposures, and I'd like us to not do that. So like the 2005 hurricane season in Miami was just like, school's canceled, going to the mall with my friends. Like, it was so chill, even though there was a storm every 2 weeks and the streets were flooded and people were like, don't wade through the storm water. And so, you know, it is kind of the difference between like a large scale emergency response and how that might be disseminated and how that might be received and what effect that might have. And then like what happens when we're just like honestly, New York a week ago, we're like, yeah, y'all, you might not want to breathe that air, but like masks aren't available until tomorrow. Like, and so then you kind of see the differences. But thank you so much for these questions.
Yes, yes.